into and digging into, but I wanted to start with something that I was reminded of as we were singing here. 2005, August 29th was what?
Sunny day.
A sunny day for some people, yes. It changed the course of history for a lot of people in this room, especially. And it brought me here. And as I was leading a group of volunteers, my staff bought me a Christmas present, a birthday present in December of 2005. So bear with me just for a second. This is a very short story, but very important. And they bought me a ticket to go see a guy named Ray Vander Laan, because in 2005, I was drawn to something that I couldn't explain. I was drawn to this understanding of the Bible from a Hebraic perspective. And you couldn't find a Hebraic perspective anywhere and anybody talking about it. There was nowhere on the internet, there was nobody talking about it. It was like, but there was like these sprinklings, and like this person might be talking about it. And he was the only person that I knew that was telling people this is the historical context of how the Bible actually was in their perspective. And my staff knew I was studying. They bought me a ticket and to go see this guy speak and a plane ticket. Went and saw him. I remember sitting there talking with him afterwards, and I was like, I got a chance to not only listen to him, I got a chance to meet him. And as I'm talking to him, I was saying, I want to learn more from you because you're like the expert on this from a Hebraic perspective. And he looked at me, he's like, I'm not an expert. He said, if you want to talk to anybody, you want to talk to Dwight Pryor. I don't know who's Dwight Pryor. You're just going to have to figure it out. Fine. So I went home, flew back to North Carolina, back to here in the mold, in the muck, in the dust, right? But the first thing I do is I look up Dwight Pryor. And I find out he's having a conference in March 2006. So it was expensive. I had to buy this one. I was like, Andrea, I got to go in the States. She's like, what? This Hebraic thing? What do you mean? I'm like, okay. So I talked her into it. I flew up there, and I'm sitting in the front row, like out, right? I'm like ready to take notes. Like it's okay that I'm nerd and geeked out about this, right? I'm not gonna sit in the back like I normally do. I want to know this stuff. I'm in the front row, and I'm sitting there, and this man, he's sitting in a chair, and he's got these hands that are, like this, because he's got advanced state of arthritis. Yeah, what's the type of arthritis that like? Rheumatoid arthritis, right? So, and he's frail, and, he's old, he's got this long white beard, and so I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, so what is this conference going to be like? And I had this yellow pad that they gave you at the door, and I have a pen and my Bible, and I find myself, as he's speaking, I'm feverishly writing down almost every word that drips out of his mouth. I can't stop. I mean, everything that he's saying is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that. I'm just like scribbling, like over and over and over. Like, wait, I'm trying to I almost like, can you stop? Like, I need to catch up. Like, but I don't want to say that because then I'll look like the fool, right? But I'm like so into this guy, like, I need to, like, he's saying things I've never heard of before. But I can't stop listening to him because it makes sense of what he's saying. And so the reason I bring that up is because the very first session, as I was thinking about putting this together, I don't know why he came to mind, but he started his seminar that he did with this passage. And I'll never forget it, because here's this frail man who can barely turn the pages of his notes, who can't necessarily get out of the chair that he's sitting in without help. And he starts this seminar with this passage from 1 Timothy. He says, "For this is good and acceptable before Elohim our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one Elohim, one God, and one mediator between Elohim and man, the man, Messiah, Yeshua." He starts out this whole seminar with the understanding, like, we're going to talk about the man, Yeshua. And for me, that put a question mark, like, okay, we're going to talk about the man, but what does that have to do with everything else? But he said, listen, we're going to talk about a lot of concepts and a lot of deep stuff about God, about the Bible. But And so I wanted to talk about that because we're going to talk about some deep concepts tonight. We're going to talk about some things that are confusing. But I want you to hold with me and maybe even hold some of your questions, because we're going to be talking about things that just sometimes they're historical, they're mystical, they're these things that you might not have heard before, and they might push some buttons in you. So I want to hold off on some of these questions until maybe the end. But I want everybody, if you have your Bible, to turn to John chapter 1. I want to start here. And who wants to read John verses 1 through 3? John 1 through 3.
I do.
Go.
In the beginning was the Word, the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made.
Okay. What do you guys know about the book of John? Has anybody done a deep dive in the study of John other than just oh man, John's my favorite book. I love reading John. There's some deep and heavy stuff in this book. And so before we get there, just really quick context. When was this book written? Anybody know? Somewhere between 90 and 100 CE, right? 90-ish in that time frame, which is after all historians say it's after the temple. And who wrote it? What? What John? John Baptist? What? John Mark? The young John. What do you mean by the young John? Okay, great. So maybe a lot of people speculate, this was the John that said, he laid his head on Jesus' chest, right? Or it was the one that said, this is the one I love, right? Most people agree that this was one of the original disciples that was with Yeshua through his whole ministry, writing this gospel, writing this account, somewhere late into life. And so a lot of people also say that this was maybe John who wrote this, or maybe not John, maybe his disciples who collected his teachings and put this in a collection or a writing posthumously after he had died. Now, this book that we have of John is written in Greek. And a lot of reason that people think this is because John, according to Polycarp, which was one of his disciples, said John didn't speak Greek or write Greek, right? He only read Aramaic and Hebrew. He couldn't speak Greek. But that's all we have is this Greek text, which is pretty ancient. And so people think, okay, maybe this was his disciples who collected these words and put this together. The other idea is that this was one book that was the last book of the Gospels that was written. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already been out there, already been spread. And John, or some of John's disciples, decided, okay, we need to write a different gospel. One that's not like the synoptics, which give the history and all the story. It's a little bit deeper. In fact, most people all agree that this was John's idea of needing to write this was to show the mystical side of this. The mysticism behind the story. Because in Mark's gospel, we get what? We get all of the miracles and all of the raw emotion of Yeshua. In Matthew's gospel, we get the Jewish teacher, the rabbi. It's this extreme Jewishness. And then in the Luke gospel is a little bit of a mixture between the Mark and the Matthew, and a little bit more history, trying to make more connections to make a little bit more point to say, look, all the way back here points to he being the Messiah. But John's gospel is completely different. It's actually confusing because it seems like it's bouncing time frames. And at one point, it almost looks like he writes this whole ministry of Yeshua within 1 year time frame. And so here's this gospel that's all about the mysticism of Yeshua. Now, some people love to talk about mysticism, right? You love this idea of connecting. And so there's this idea of Jewish Kabbalah, which has been around for over 2,000 years. And Jewish Kabbalah is Eastern mysticism. It's this idea of these things that are just, when people have visions, the prophets were mystics. The prophets Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, these guys were ancient mystics, and they had these visions, they had these dreams that God would come upon them, and they would say, thus saith the Lord. This is what God has said. Right? There are these very mystical things that happen. It wasn't just these prophets, it was something that was studied by groups of people. There was this idea that you could connect to the spiritual elements of the supernatural, the things that you can't see, but for some reason you know they're there. It doesn't make sense, but yet it does somehow make sense. And so this is John's whole gospel. The idea of something that is hard to understand. In fact, the Talmud talks about, because it's so hard to understand, they actually put an age of how old you have to be until you can study this. Okay? How old do you have to be? What's your guess? 40. 40. Why 40? They have a term for it. It's not until 40 that you've reached understanding. Right? As well as by the time you're 40, you should have all of the Torah memorized. So it's one of those things where the rabbis have this conception that you shouldn't talk about these things. In fact, I think I have another passage up here, another place in the Torah. It says there are certain subjects that may not be taught in the presence of three. And these subjects I was talking about is especially the Genesis account. Because the Genesis account, all the rabbis agree, this is not a literal statement. There is something mystical that is taking place here, and that you have volumes of literature of these different mystics that are trying to explain the creation story. As far down to is the Hebrew alphabet starts with what letter? Aleph. What's the second letter? Bet. So shouldn't Genesis start with Aleph? Because it's the first letter. If this is the first creation, shouldn't it start with Aleph? And it doesn't. It starts with what? Bet. Bereshit. Right? So you have literally pages and pages and pages about this idea of why it starts with Bet. And it's not part of our subject. But just the idea that there was this idea that you shouldn't even talk about it in the presence of two. Right? And you whisper this stuff because it's so hard to understand. And then here comes Yeshua, and he kind of blows the whole thing up. He says, no. What we talk about, like, secretly in whispers, right? In the dark, like, we gotta keep this secret because it's so hard to understand. He says, no, shout it from the rooftops! This is powerful stuff. We need to know this stuff. Another reason why the Pharisees didn't like it, right? So today, things have changed. I mean, you can get all kinds of literature on Kabbalah, meditation. You can get I have 20 books on Jewish mysticism in my office, somewhere buried in the other books from the library, right? So there's all kinds of literature that is out there today. But in the first century, it was relegated to just a small few. And like I said, mainly because it's so hard to understand that you could misunderstand it and apply it in a way that wasn't meant to be applied, which could be dangerous. We have those things today, right? We have situations you could probably point to today, like, wait, I know you said that, but you don't understand the reason behind why you're doing that. Whether it be from construction, to theology, to business, right? There's always these things that can be misunderstood. And in my opinion, John 1 happens to be one of those things that's very misunderstood. So we're going to go there for a few minutes. And I want to just point out a few things that you probably already know. But I'm going to ask you to look at them maybe a little bit differently. Just be a little open-minded for a minute to just think, okay, could this be a little bit different than I understood it before? And so, in the first century, when John writes this gospel, there was actually many teachings of a word that was called logos. Right? You know what logos is? Right? In the beginning was the word. No. In the beginning was the logos. Right? That's what it says. A logos is a Greek word. Right? That's a Greek word that means, in classical Greek, it means word. But it's not how the rabbis of the first century used the word. And you can see this because there was two other words for this same Greek word. The other word in Aramaic was memra. And in Hebrew, the word was debur. Right? So you have logos in Greek. If I'm speaking to you in Greek, if I'm speaking to you in Aramaic, I would say memra. But if we're having a conversation in Hebrew, I'm saying debur. It's this word that all the rabbis understood that this was this thing because in the or the Torah. Not necessarily the words that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai, but the essence of Torah, God's will. This was the Torah that was in the beginning. Or there's another passage that talks about wisdom. That in the beginning was wisdom. This Debor, this memra was actually wisdom. You see this, I'm going to point out a few things here. You see this throughout the teachings. In fact, in Proverbs, which you probably never even saw this before, let me just read you a couple. Proverbs 3:19 says this. Jehovah founded the earth by wisdom. He founded the earth by wisdom. He established the heavens by understanding. Then again, he says this. Jehovah possessed me, the beginning of his way, as the first of his works of old. I was set up ages ago, at the first, before the earth was ever. Then I was beside him, a master workman. What was beside him? Who was this beside him? What was this? Rabbis point to this idea. In fact, in a really ancient document, in some Bibles, you have this, is the book of Sirach. It says this, wisdom was in the beginning and created by God. In fact, there are other translations of the Hebrew Bible in Aramaic. They're called Targums. And there's a Targum that was written in Babylon and a Targum that was written in Jerusalem. And they actually differ on what Genesis 1:1 says. The 1:1 from Babylon says this, from the beginning, with wisdom, the Lord created the heavens and the earth. The one from Jerusalem says, in wisdom, the Lord created. Which is a little bit different than our English translations, isn't it? From what we typically think of when we read the Bible. Think then, if this is the mindset of the first century rabbis, if this is how they understood the creation story, this is how they understood Genesis 1:1. If we try to take that mindset of how they understood this, the mysticism of this, and apply this to John's mysticism, how would John 1:1-3 maybe differ? How would it change? How would we maybe reinterpret it through that perspective? Right here. In the beginning was the wisdom. And the wisdom was with God. And the wisdom was God. It was in the beginning with God. Everything was made to exist through wisdom. And nothing that was made to exist except by it. This logos, this memra, this dubur, whether it be word or wisdom or the essence of Torah, this is the agent of godly understood. Kind of like 007. Anybody like 007? Right? 007 was a what? He was a secret agent. Right? And so we think, sometimes when we think of agent, we think of, James Bond, what's an agent? But if you think of what an agent is, or what agency is, what is it? It's somebody who has been given authority. James Bond was given authority by the Queen, right? To make his own decisions in lieu of the Queen. If he was making a decision, it's what the Queen would have wanted. If he needed to kill somebody, it's because that's what the Queen would have wanted. He was an agent. And so what is wisdom? Wisdom, or logos, or memra, debor, was the agent that God used in the mystics idea to create the world. It was the essence of God in action. Now, John 1:14. Who's reading John? Go back to 1:14, please.
And the Word, and the wisdom became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Does anybody have, in that very first sentence, anybody have a different translation? The very first sentence. Nobody?
And the Word became human and lived among us. We saw his glory. It was the glory that the Father shares.
Wait, right there. So he came, he dwelt, and he lived among us. Is there another translation, anybody? There's a little bit different translation. Some say that you lived with us, and then if you take that back to, and there are some Bibles that actually say it, but the actual word in the Hebrew is that this memra, this wisdom, tabernacled with us, which is an interesting phrase that John would use. Because why would you use the word tabernacle? What does tabernacle have to do with this? What's a tabernacle?
That's where God dwelt.
What? It's where God dwelt, right? In fact, 1 Corinthians 6:16 says this: "What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God." He says in 1 Corinthians, "Or do you not know that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you?" Right? This all comes from this idea of Leviticus, that when God dwelt in the midst of the people, where did he dwell? In the tabernacle. And then you have this mystical Paul, which we won't go there tonight, but Paul was also very mystical, beyond, I think, most of the other writers, right? But he comes up with this idea that, no, it's not just in the temple. The Spirit of God can actually dwell in you as a human being, and not just in you. He says in the next one that it can dwell in us when we come together. This gathering of people can be a tabernacle that God can dwell in. And so as I thought about this, there was something in this book here that pressed this button for me. And the question, where does this idea come from? Where's John getting some of these ideas? And there's 3 words in the Genesis account, that are used for soul. And the rabbis looked at these 3 words, and we've talked about this before. There's 3s and 7s. There's these patterns of 3s and 7s and 10, and 3s and 7s and 10. All of this over and over and over. What do the patterns mean? And one of the 3s in the pattern is these 3 words that mean the same thing. They are neshama, ruach, and nefesh. And they all have the same meaning, but they all have different roots, which is fascinating because the neshama is this idea of breath. When you take it to its root, it's this breath. When we think of breath in Genesis 1, what do you think of? What did God do with breath? He breathed, right? Breath. The ruach, we've talked about before, is spirit, but what also does it mean? Where does it come from? It's the idea of what? Wind, right? But you can't see wind, can you? You can feel the wind. The ruach isn't something you see, it's something you feel, it's something you experience, it's something maybe you hear. You feel the effects of the wind, but you don't see the wind. And then the nefesh is also another word for soul. And you know this word really well because hopefully you say this prayer every day, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Echad, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. We shall love the Lord our God with all of our what? With all of our lev, and with all of our nefesh. Nefesh is our body. Our body is a container for the soul. So you have wind, you have breath, you have a container, and it's this idea that the mystics kind of put together. I'm sorry, you're supposed to already hit that video. This idea that the breath of God is then moved by and experienced by the ruach and into this body. And the mystics taught this idea that it's like a wind or a glass blower. Has anybody ever gone to see a glass blower? Right, there used to be a shop right here. It's fascinating. My friend Mitchell, right over this building. You would blow into this tool, and the wind would travel through it, and you could mold and shape this glass into something. You could change it. You could make them all the same. You could make them individual. You could change it exactly however you wanted to. And who was doing it? The one with the breath. And he would put it back in the fire, or he would bring it out, and he would breathe into it a little bit more, and the wind would go through this thing, and it would continue to open up and expand this nefesh. And so this is how the mystics saw the mysticism of God. The breath of God moving, the ruach of God being felt or experienced into the nephesh, into our bodies, filling inside of us. This is how prophets experienced visions. This is how they said that when it talks about thus said the Lord, it's this idea that the Lord came upon them. Literally came upon them, and that's just what had to come out. This is their idea of how that happened. The nephesh and the ruach spoke and blew into them and then into their soul, and it had to just come out of them. And this is how we still experience God today. Now here's the crazy part. John knows this concept. He believes in this. He teaches this. And he adds something a little bit different to his gospel. John doesn't say that it's the ruach. He says that it's the logos that dwelt within Yeshua. The memra, the wisdom, the Torah came down and dwelt among men. The agent that helped create the universe came down and tabernacled in a man, in the midst of men. The Torah, the Logos, this wisdom descended and was living in man. If we keep reading the Gospel of John, reader, when does this actually happen? John 1:32, 33, 32 and 33, please.
And 32. And John bore witness. I saw the Spirit descend from heaven like a dove, and it remained on him. I myself did not know him, but he who sent me to baptize with water said to me, He on whom you see the Spirit descend and remain, this is he who baptizes with the Holy Spirit. And 34.
The breath of God, the Neshama speaks. The Ruach is seen, felt by John as he sees or experiences this thing coming out of the sky. And where does it dwell? Where does it tabernacle? In this man that it rests upon. Yeshua is the one and only man to experience the Memra, the Logos. The man chosen by God to be the expression of his will to humanity. To show people how to live as a human being and how to lead as a king. To teach the true essence of this Torah. Yeshua is the man who is king and Messiah for all of humanity. And I think that the Bible points this out explicitly so that each one of us in this room can actually relate to him. Because in Marcion's gospel, who was considered a heretic, Jesus was not a man. But I think that the writers and even John point to the fact that he is this man, so that this person who is tested, who taught these things, who lived these things, are the same things that we can actually do as well. That we can actually live these teachings out. So we don't have this excuse, well, that's just God, I can't actually do that. No. These are things that God doesn't just teach, he expects us to do. Because humanity shows us that it is possible. It is possible to stay away from sin. It is possible to stay away from these things. It is possible to live this life. It is possible to get up early every morning before the sun comes up and pray to God every single day. To connect with the Spirit somehow so that he can connect in this mystical way. And that it can fill him up and that we too can be filled up by the Spirit and we can live with the fullness of that in us and it can pour out like a vase that has been molded and shaped by God the Father. And we are living out the words of Yeshua, the Messiah, to do exactly as he did. We are to emulate his life, to walk as he walked, to pursue the Spirit as he taught us to. Ephesians tells us this. See then that you walk exactly, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are wicked. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the desire of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is. And do not be drunk with wine, in which is loose behavior, but be filled with the Spirit, which I've taught before means be being, continually seek to be filled with the Spirit, speaking to each other in songs and songs of praise and spiritual songs, singing and striking the strings in your heart to the Master, giving thanks always for our God, Elohim the Father, in the name of our Master, Yeshua, the Messiah.
What was that from? Last name?
Ephesians 5. That was Paul. Yeah. The mystic telling us to pursue the spiritual. To pursue the Spirit of God, to be filled with it on a daily basis. That we, by doing so, would better understand the Messiah in every single thing that we do. I find this important because I think it's easy to get complacent. It's easy to go to church. It's easy to, I'm a good person. I read my Bible once in a while. I pray. I thank God for the food. I pray for the things I want. It's harder to actually have a desire to pursue the things that you cannot see. To pray for that connection, to have that experience where you actually hear or are moved or pushed in a direction that you can't explain, but you know it happened to you. And then to actually be obedient to that as well. That is the essence of what Paul says, how the Spirit Lord tabernacles with a group of people that do that. When the Spirit moves us as a group and individually. If we pursue the Spirit, but it's on us. How did the Israelites get out of Egypt? They walked. They had to put effort into this exodus. God will open up the doors for us. God will provide everything that we need. But we have to walk. We have to move. We have to pursue. Sometimes we might have to fight for that time to do it as well. As I thought about it, I was going to sing that song one time, but I don't want too much. Because I also think it's important to sing. As Paul said, the strings of our heart. These things are also in the mystical things. There are a chance that we sing the words of God and it moves us. It's something that's important that we do as a community, as a group as well. So I pray that next week